Hello and welcome to Nature Knowledge. This is a speaker series with experts sharing scientific knowledge on current issues affecting nature in Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Shelly Johnson, State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources with University of Florida IFAS Extension. Thanks for joining us today.
We're gonna welcome Dr. Mark Hostetler. He's going to be talking today about conserving bird habitat in cities. And I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and let him take over.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this virtual presentation. I'm excited about talking about birds in cities and how to conserve habitat. To give you a little more background about myself, I'm an urban and wildlife ecologist. I've been working and researching and working with landowners and developers and policymakers and planners for the past 25 years. And many of the research and extension work that I've been doing is trying to figure out how we can design and manage cities for biodiversity, in particular for bird species. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and kind of give you a couple of ideas about some way to evaluate habitat, and also some recent research that some of my students have done. So without further ado, I will share my presentation here. And I'm acknowledging Yan Archer. Yan was a graduate student of mine that helped put together this online tool that I'll be talking about. And we were thinking about cities and evaluating habitat and design. He was instrumental in doing some of the literature review, which I'll talk about, and also some of the online tool development. Now, so you can imagine, I can only see a few of you, probably a lot of you have seen birds in cities, and we're just gotten through the migration season. There's a lot of wintering species, wintering migrants that are down here. I've heard, I'm outside right now, and I've heard, quite often I've heard different migrants, yellow rump warblers. I've heard just currently different types of species that are not here during the summer, but here during the winter. So what I'm going to be doing is kind of give an overview and kind of the problem when we think about designing cities and managing cities for bird habitat. Some of it may be pretty basic, but I'm not going to assume that everyone knows a little bit about avian ecology. So I'll start off with that. Then I'll go into a little bit about a new tool that was developed a few years ago to give planners, designers, homeowners a way to evaluate habitat in their homes and neighborhoods. And then I'm going to end on some new research. Just came out like a week ago. It hasn't been published yet, but my student has been working diligently and sent me some summary of the research that we've been working on about stopover habitat in and around urban areas, and so particularly in Gainesville in this situation. So I'll give you a little bit teaser on that. So essentially, if you think about conserving bird habitat in cities, there's really no simple evaluation tool. That there's a lot of research out there. Birds tend to be one of the more heavily studied taxa within cities, mainly because they're charismatic. A lot of people see them, people feed them, all bird feeders, and like to see birds in their backyard. But let's take a look at this two example you have here on the left. If you think the yellow areas are forest patches, compared to conserving a large forest patch and a small forest patch, which type of species would you find in those different types of scenarios? In particular, if you start conserving these forest fragments and even tree canopy cover, which species would be most affected across different cities? But it's not easy. I mean, you have to have an urban ecologist come in there and really evaluate the land, but there might be kind of a back of the paper napkin way to evaluate it. And that's what we attempted to do with this new online tool. So how does it different development design? So if you're a city's expanding, or if you're a landowner and you're going to create a development, how do different designs impact different forest birds? And we're concentrating on forest birds here throughout this presentation, because typically many of the upland areas do have forests. And so it's important, if you think about the tree conservation, how does it impact these different forest species? So before we get started, of course, we have to really think about the ecology of the birds themselves. They have different seasons. They have a breeding season. They have a wintering that we are in Florida right now, which is the non-breeding season. And we have the migration season. So a lot of birds, hundreds of birds, in fact, migrate from the north to the south during the fall, and from the south to the north. You know, we're talking all the way to Central and South America, and they're passing through Florida. So it's important to think about these three seasons, because some of the literature, as you'll see, says that they respond to different features in the landscape. But we do have year-round species. I mean, you're probably familiar with cardinals, tufted titmice, not black-capped chickadees, Caroline chickadees in Florida, and screech owls. Those all are around year-round. But we do have neotropical migrants. Here's a few of them, like the yellow warbler, black-throated green warbler. These species migrate through Florida. And if I'm to bring up the yellow warbler there, the kind of the burnt orange is this breeding range. The yellow is its migration path. You know, so you can see them doing stopover site. They won't be found in Florida during the winter, and they occur in the blue areas in the Columbian Basin in Central America. And so we've just seen yellow warblers pass through. They're already through Florida, but as they're passing through Florida, they may use different types of habitat than they do in their breeding range or even their wintering range. So that's kind of just a brief overview and the importance of looking at across the different seasons or life histories of birds. So kind of the take-home message is that your backyard, a neighborhood, could serve as a breeding site. It could serve as a stopover site. It could serve as a wintering site, even a dispersal site. So different species may appear in the city at different times of the year. So knowing this and knowing a little bit about the literature, we wanted to break up a systematic review, all the empirical research that's out there, and summarize it. And so in order to do this, we first looked at studies that were done during the breeding season, and we were looking for area sensitivity. So in forest fragments or even in residential areas, do birds, are they found in these small fragments? And if they're not, they're probably area sensitive, and then they won't breed in these in cities and urban areas. Then we looked at stopover ecological studies, and we're looking at during the spring and fall migration seasons in and around cities and forest fragments that occur in and around cities. Are they using them as stopover habitat? As they're migrating, they need to refuel, they need shelter. And so they're occurring in these areas. And that's an important part of the life history of migrants, because if you don't have that habitat, they can't make that long migration from the north to the south. I mean, it takes a long way to get there, and they just can't do it on fat reserves done in the breeding area. They have to get more food as they're going. And the last review was the built environment review. This is research, and there's a lot of research in residential areas, in commercial areas within cities. So think of neighborhoods with trees, but underneath you have pavement, you have mowed lawns, you have ornamentals sometimes, and sometimes you have native species. So those type of studies, we looked at across all those three, and we were trying to summarize, all right, which birds breed in fragments or in residential areas, or do they stop over in fragments in residential areas? So not to go through all the nitty gritty of how you doing a systematic review, we're just going to do into the results. And what we did find across North America and Canada, there's 75 species that could breed in forests ranging in size to 1 to 5 to 50 acres. Now, we were very conservative. We were saying that we had to at least have 3 published studies. This number can be quite a bit larger, and I'll talk about that in a second. But at least being conservative, we at least have identified 75 species that could breed in forest small fragments. But we found 15 that were interior forest specialist species. These typically will not breed in small fragments. They're vulnerable. They might nest on the ground or lower understory, so they're vulnerable to predators. And so they tend to focus on the interior of large patches to breed. Then we looked at stopover studies. We found 116 species that could use small fragments. Many of these were long-distant neotropical migrants, and I'll talk more about this, some of these were what we consider interior forest specialists that breed in large forest fragments, but during the migration path, they actually are using small fragments as stopover areas. So even a species during the breeding season and the migration season uses different types of habitats. And when we look at the residential areas, we have over 100 species that could use residential areas for breeding or stopover. Many of these species can breed in these residential areas. Some just use them as stopover sites during the migration season. And one of the important take-home messages that interior forest specialists use residential areas as stopover sites. So an example of a migrant, this American redstart, it's come through Florida just recently. It does require, typically is considered an interior forest specialist. So when we look at studies, empirical studies, they tend to breed in large 1,000 acres or more forest tracts. But during migration, they do use small urban forest patches to forage and rest in. And even in residential areas, we found them in studies. So they actually use both tree canopy within residential areas and across small urban forest patches. So given all of the, we have 200 more species that we're talking about, how do we create a tool that says, well, what kind of species, what kind of habitat scores will you get when you look at small little 5-acre patches or larger patches that are conserved across the city? So this is called Building for Birds. That URL up there is, I know it's kind of long. It's through our Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. But if you just Google Building for Birds, University of Florida, it will take you to the site. And there's a tool, it gives a little introduction about the goal for Building for Birds, and it's meant for decision makers, whether you're a homeowner, whether you're a planner or a policymaker. How can you evaluate different sections of a city or the growth of a city and how it's going to impact different species? Now, when we first started out, we were doing all this GIS and it got really complicated. As an ecologist, I really kind of dove into the weeds because there was a lot of nuances about habitat use. But working with planners and designers, they really kind of turned me away from the nuance and said, we just need something simple that we can evaluate very quickly. And it may not address everything, but it will address the bulk of the empirical research that's out there. And so we simplified it into 2 inputs. We did patch sizes of conserved late and early successional forests, and I'll talk about the difference between late and early in a second here. And the amount of tree canopy cover in the built area. So those 2 variables, if you're analyzing a development site and you're trying to figure out where you're going to put the homes and how much habitat to conserve, you can do different designs and put in these 2 inputs to get habitat scores. So this is kind of what the evaluation tool looks like. It's 5 steps. First is just a descriptive. You put in your name, you choose your scenario, etc. Step 2 is you, if you're looking at a section of a city or if you're developing a site, you put in the amount of conserved late successional forests that you plan, well, how much there is actually there to begin with, and also early successional forests. And what I mean by late successional forests, think about in terms of tree canopy cover. So if you're walking in a forest and you look up and you see a lot of tree canopy above you, that's considered late successional forest. So it kind of looks like this. Early successional forest, you can imagine a recent fire or hurricane, or might be a habitat that has very little tree canopy cover, very little large trees, and it looks something like this. And there are different species that key in on this, but for the purposes of this study, we assign points based on late successional forest and early successional forest, and I'll describe that in a second. So that's for the breeding and also wintering habitat. For the stopover habitat, when we look through the empirical research, slightly larger fragments tend to attract more species and higher amounts of individuals within a particular species. So you could, if you're going to conserve 50 acres of habitat, you could do 50 acres of one fragment, or you could divide up into 10 small 5-acre fragments, and you get more points based on the larger patch because it tends to be better for stopover habitat. But it's still a fragment, still under 1,000 acres. It's just that the slightly larger fragments attract more species. And then the last part is how much tree canopy cover is going to be conserved or is conserved if you're valuing a section of the city within the built area. So you can imagine there are certain areas that might be open space that has no buildings or roads underneath, but those that do have buildings and roads, how much of the tree canopy cover you'll conserve. And if you live in Gainesville, Florida, we have quite a significant amount of tree canopy cover across the city. And once you enter those numbers in, everything is as in acres of like tree canopy cover or number of forest fragments, the amount of forest fragments, then it will calculate a score. And it'll break down the score into breeding wintering habitat score, and there's a bird list associated with that. There's also stopover habitat score, and there's a built environment habitat score. And the neat thing about this is it'll give you a little printout of this, and you can imagine those bars will shift depending on what design you have, how much of the tree canopy you conserve, how big are the forest patches they actually conserve in that design, or if you're evaluating an established section of the city, what those values are. So let's work through an example here. Let's say you have a total of 100 acres and you want to develop about 50 of it, and 50 of it is going to be undeveloped. You could do it different ways. This is one scenario. At the pre-development, there's 30 acres of early successional, 70 of late, and the amount of tree canopy cover in the built areas is about 50%, 50 acres. Post-development, all the early successional has been developed. Late successional, they conserve 71%, and of the trees in the developed area, they conserve 80% of that. So there's a really simple algorithm behind this. I won't dive too much into it. Just imagine for stopover habitat and for breeding habitat, late successional forest gets more points because the edges mimic early successional forests. A lot of edge species are in early successional forest shrubland, but the edge of the late successional forest has that similar characteristic. I'm not going to go into the nuances of that, except that late successional forest, it takes a while to grow a big tree and get tree canopy cover. So you get more points for conserving that versus early successional. For stopover, you get more points for larger fragments on to 70 acres or more. And for tree canopy in the built area, it's just simply you get a point for every acre that's conserved of tree canopy cover. that gives you a figure of, you can imagine those bars shifting back and forth depending on how your design is administered. And so you can imagine it's a good way to evaluate the different scores across the development site. The numbers down below are relevant to the site itself. And so you can't compare a site that, let's say, a 50-acre development versus a 5,000-acre development, because those numbers will be quite a bit larger because you're just inputting more acreage in a 5,000-acre development. But the relative scores between that within a site can tell you which design gives you the best score for avian habitat conservation. Now, that's kind of a little bit about the tool associated with that, and this is where I kind of hang my hat. This is the first time we reviewed the literature, and we can kind of give an indication, does this bird breed in a forest fragment? Does it use it as a stopover site? Does it breed in a residential area? And does it use it as a stopover site in a residential area? And again, we were very conservative. We said you had to have 3 studies or more to get a check or an X. So ruby-throated hummingbird at the top, you see 4 X's across the top. It makes sense intuitively. If you live in Florida, you see that hummingbirds breeding in your backyard and migrating through in that area. Let's look at a black and white warbler. So that's an interior forest specialist. It won't breed in forest fragments. It won't breed in residential areas. When I say it won't breed, it typically will not. But it does use stopover habitat, forest fragments during the migration season. And we found some studies, the question mark is saying we found some studies that they do use residential areas, but we didn't find 3. So we just put a question mark there. Yellow warbler there, if it's blank, we have, some species, there's not enough studies or no studies that show about breeding in forest fragments. And so we left those blank. So we have over 215 species that we address, that both the eastern and the western species. So the take-home messages from this, I hope, is that a lot of times we think of residential areas as, they're bad, they're not sufficient habitat for a variety of species, but they do provide stopover and breeding habitat for over 100 forest bird species, and this could be well over 180, mainly because we were very conservative, and we found indications of them, a couple studies here or there saying that they do use residential areas, but we just were conservative, said have 3 or more studies to definitively say that they use it. Some interior forest specialists, that's important to recognize, use these forest fragments in residential areas as stopover habitat. So of the 15 that we identified as interior forest specialists in this review, 10 of them do use these small forest fragments in residential areas. And that forest fragments provide stopover and breeding habitat for over 130 forest bird species, and it could be well over 200. And my suspicion is many of those migrants that we don't have research on are also doing, like the migrants are using stopover areas in cities. We just don't have enough research to definitively say that. So the tips are fairly straightforward. But what I think is happening when I talk to built environment professionals, planners, developers, landscape architects, they say, well, it's not a large patch. So it's easier, let's just chop everything down. It's easier to put the roads in, not worry about the forest because they're small fragments and it's just an individual tree. But from this review, we really see that these forest fragments and individual trees help improve habitat scores, and a lot of species use them. Late successional, if you were going to put your area in like a old orange grove that doesn't have very much late successional habitat, it's better to put it there than in a mature forest. So conserve that late successional forest as compared to early successional. And larger patches, relatively larger patches, we're not talking huge continuous forests, attract more migrants to stopover habitat. So if you could condense, do a compact development and conserve a little bit of a larger patch that way, is beneficial for more species during the migration season. So that's kind of it in about the online tool. And I like to talk about some recent exciting research that we've been doing here in Gainesville. So I have a student, Ryan Buron, that's been looking, one of the questions that came out of this review study is, okay, are there certain species that are using residential areas and forest fragments? And are there certain species that tend to really favor just the forest fragments versus residential areas? You can imagine the vertical height structure, and when you look from the ground to the canopy, is a lot different in a residential area than in a forest fragment, because all of those individual structures, small trees, shrubby things that go up to the canopy tend to be less in residential areas. So this study we did in Gainesville, Florida, we're still doing the analysis, but one thing we found, there's quite a few birds, migrants that use residential trees and forest fragments, but some migrants occurred more often in these forest fragments that typically have more vertical height structure. So what were those? Many of these were canopy foraging birds. So birds that typically forage up in the upper canopy, they were found equally between the residential and the forest fragments. And that makes sense because there is still canopy in the residential areas. We typically looked at residential areas with a lot of tree canopy cover. But birds that typically forage under the canopy prefer the forest fragment more often. And so again, that kind of fits with the idea that that vertical height structure is very important. I have another student that's looking, although we see under canopy foraging species in residential areas, just not as often. And she's looking to see whether more lots with a lot more vegetation tend to track those species. Now, I've left out a lot of nuance about habitat selection, and one of the big things is that you need to go beyond design. So you can imagine, sure, design is important, but what about protecting the trees during construction? What about post-construction, managing trees over the long term? You have invasive exotics that can impact the diversity of trees and the diversity of insects that the birds are feeding on, for example. And also you could have feral cat colonies that are run throughout the neighborhood that can have impact on species. So design, this is the first cut at it, but management, and if you're constructing a site, is important to keep those trees over the long term and to keep the bird habitat over the long term. This is a website that gives a lot more information, extension fact sheets about wildlife habitat and conserving wildlife habitat, both within cities, within rural areas. So you can see quite a bit there to find out more information. And that's my email address. If you, after this talk, you have some specific questions that don't get answered and you'd like to find out more information, I'm happy to answer those questions at any time. So yeah, just email me. Again, I'm very passionate. I think if anything you take from this talk is that, yes, residential cities can be good habitat for birds if we do it appropriately. So instead of just saying, oh, we'll concentrate outside of cities, I think a lot of these cities can provide a significant amount of habitat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. And
all right, thank you. That was great. So there are a few questions in the chat, and I'm sure some more will populate in there. If anyone has questions, you can put them in the chat. So just to help you out, the first kind of question I think about the content is at 329 in the chat. If you want to start there, and then
okay, yeah, Gail.
Yeah.
Yeah. So does your team have any interaction with the city's arborists and planners, for example, in Gainesville? Yes. So we've been working with the Department of Alachua County Department of Environmental Protection and some of the planners in the city, giving that information. And so next spring, we're giving a talk to both of those the staff and personnel at the Alachua County DEP and the city of Gainesville. So yes, we are trying to get that information to them. We've done some presentations already in the past about the tool, so they're aware of the tool, but we're also giving more information about the types of birds that use those different habitats, you know, the forest fragment versus the residential. So yes, Gail, we are using that. Can you consider using a source like eBird? Yeah, so eBird's a great source that kind of gives us an idea, and we do use that. So my current student who's looking at breeding habitat between 3 species, summer tanagers, northern parulas, and pileated woodpeckers, we kind of looked at eBird to see whether they were found in residential areas in Gainesville and where they were most often found. I mean, it makes intuitive sense where there's a lot of forest cover, they're found there. But those are considered, when we did the literature review, as interior forest specialists. And we have a suspicion that it's regionally different. Most of these interior forest specialist studies were done in the Northeast, but in the South, for example, the northern parula, really Spanish moss or epiphytes hanging from trees is where they nest in. There's quite a bit in Gainesville. So yeah, eBird's a great way to get at where birds occur and help design our studies or evaluate some of our studies. Yes, so construction companies, yeah, that's one of the things. Engineers, they say, well, why should we conserve that large tree and make it has a, you know, like a heritage oak or a heritage tree that has a large tree canopy cover? They're like, it's just easier just to cut it down and make the road go straight through. What we hope is this type of research and tool will show the importance of even the individual trees. And so I really, if anyone likes to use the tool and try it out and give feedback based on whatever neck of the woods are coming from, whether they're a planner or a citizen, what we have found that it just sheds light on the importance of individual trees and tree forest fragments in cities. And before, a lot of people think, oh, it's too fragmented, we got to go outside. So what about so from Susan, what about the quality of residential areas? Yes, so the quality issue, that's when, as an ecologist, I went into the weeds. And so I started thinking, well, it does matter what type of tree there is. There's research out there that shows exotic trees, particularly exotic street trees, don't have as many, the arthropod abundance, insect abundance is not as much. And also a lot of migrant species that winter. This is a study in California. When you go up and down the street trees, they tend to focus on the native ones. So yes, it does matter. Associated with this tool is several fact sheets that kind of goes into the nuance of, well, we're talking about quality of habitat as well. So you have that, if you have all eucalyptus trees or all melaleuca trees, yeah, that's not the type of habitat or tree habitat we're talking about. We're talking about native trees that provide more habitat. So this one, we're looking at the structure. So given all things kind of equal, if we just were, it's not muddying the water, but just looking on average, the more tree structure you conserve, both with a forest fragment or a tree canopy cover, it tends to attract and provide habitat for species. But again, if it was all Australian pines, yeah, I agree, it doesn't offer anything. Yes, there, Rose, there is a recording. That's correct, Shelly?
Yes.
Yep. So how do we successfully encourage residential planting of bird-friendly native plantings and structure? Good question. So I have found over the years that model yards or model developments go a long way. So it takes that one maverick to do something different and then to promote it. So there was a community in Madera, in Gainesville, and one in Harmony near the Kissimmee in Florida. And once you have that first person take a step, it really shows that it's not too difficult to do this and the benefits for doing this. Another thing we have done is we've promoted a signage program. So imagine your neighborhood, you're walking your dog down the sidewalk and it has a sign about the importance of trees and forest fragments in the neighborhood and vertical height structure. So it's really difficult, but that conversation between neighbors and between developers is really kind of the best way to go about having people change their behavior. So like to give you one story, I had a property when I was a graduate student, just a small home. I stopped mowing the lawn, let all the succession happen. And my neighbors at first were like horrified what was going on. But as the succession over the next 10 years turned into, first a lot of wild cherry trees and laurel, cherry, et cetera, turned into canopy, it became a beautiful property. And then my neighbors on the left and right side of me stopped mowing their portion of their yard too. It took them about 5 or 7 years to stop doing that. They still have a little bit of their yard that's mowed, and I have a whole nother talk on what we call cues to care. So the idea is, how many cues in the landscape do you need to have to make it acceptable? So you can't just go totally wild like I did, that was, as an ecologist, I saw the beauty in that wildness. But you can do what's called controlled chaos. So you have a front patch or a back patch that you let all the vegetation come up, and then you border it with some border grass or rocks or signage or a fence that shows that it's being maintained in some way. And that cue can provide the aesthetics to your neighbors and to yourself, depending on your own aesthetic preferences, that it's being managed in some way. So yeah, there are opportunities. I call it controlled chaos. So have areas that are chaotic along with areas that are more well groomed, and that mixture makes it socially acceptable and provides habitat. Next question from Donna, as follow-up supplement to the generic online tool, is there work being done to identify specific patches in different communities that birds are using? Yeah, so the idea of what patches, yeah, it's kind of overall patches are good. But like my student right now is doing what specific patches or what kind of lots are they being attracted to? So the idea behind that study is, and probably what we'll find is that more vertical height structure, that more chaotic, you'll get more species there. So it's hard to really, habitat selection is one of those studies that are really hard to pinpoint, but you can at least say in general that patches attract more species. Now there's certain species that I've indicated before that are interior forest specialists that won't go to those small patches, but many will. So is the edge habitat in a forest fragment or residential area impact the number of birds visiting? Well, again, it's a difficult thing to answer in a specific way, but in general, if you have that combination of mature forests and edges, it attracts a whole wide variety of species. Now, how much of that forest fragment, the mature forest and more of the interior conditions is attractive, we're still kind of teasing that out for those species that could use them as stopover sites. But my suspicion is that the edges, the ones that forage understory or under the canopy, tend to avoid the edge habitat during stopover, during migration, and they focus in on more of the mature forest. Barbara says, I've seen black and white warblers in urban areas that have oak trees. Yeah. So black and whites are one of those species. We have seen them in urban areas. In fact, this study in Gainesville has confirmed that. So I think the combination, the habitat complexity, the more complex you can get it, the better. So the tree, when you look from the tree canopy to the ground, that more complexity is better for a wide variety of species. So that dense, the question is, my yard has a margin of dense shrubby trees, mostly laurel cherry. Should I try to remove it, or more herbaceous species? No, I would say for the forest species, those laurel cherries that provides fruit, there's lots of insects associated with that. Let that come up and it can provide quite a bit of habitat for those forest birds. Yeah, the GIS data, that one's, you know, I just go to Google Earth or Google Maps. You can get aerials and you can look at whatever your neighborhood, and you can measure the amount of tree canopy cover that you have, or the amount of areas that don't have built areas within it. So I would say keep it simple. I mean, of course, there's all kinds of programs out there to do GIS, but for the more simple ones, you could just use Google Earth or Google Maps. Yeah, hurricane resistant. There's that's beyond kind of the topic today, but if you go to Extension EDIS online, it's a fact sheets that you can, if you search in there hurricane resistant trees, there's been some studies that show, like, you know, water oaks are not that good. You want live oaks, that type of thing. Yep, margins seem to be well used by birds for cover. That's correct. Those edges, little things on the edge, different species tend to focus in on that. From Helen says, does it make sense to also include the discussion of understory as well as the canopy? Yeah, so that's that whole idea, that vertical height structure, that understory is important for certain species. So both forest fragments in urban areas that have that good understory, and even individual residential areas, you can imagine you have that corner lot corner portion of your lot that's next to another lot that hasn't mowed, and so you can make that understory habitat within the yard. Other questions? Let's see. Yeah, I love to hear your talk on cues. Yeah, that's I think what it is it's variable. We really don't know exactly which cues, but you have an idea, and there's some studies out there that anything that shows some type of management, mowed, trimmed, hedged, fences, that kind of stuff, is a great way to create that. Someone has a question about a kind of a statement about a maverick in Port St. Lucie. That I think that's great. Once you get those examples introduced into a community, then people can see it, they can touch it, they can see, well, it's can be done. But yeah, you can see that some people, maybe the cue is not there, that it's being managed. It's a little bit too wild for them. So this person in Port St. Lucie may be harassed by their neighbors, even by the city and county ordinances.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and you're welcome to keep answering and asking questions. I am going to go ahead and launch a really short little evaluation. If anyone can take a minute to just fill it out, it's just 4 multiple choice questions. So, yep, and then we have 10 more minutes to answer questions if you would like. Okay.
I'll try to work through these. There's a question about any specific species you would highlight in South Florida. Well, I mean, right now the migrants are down there. Yellow rump warblers. You got flickers, common northern flickers that are down there, and of course the sandhill cranes. I mean, how can we forget? I mean, they're not forest species, but the sandhill cranes are migrated down. Question about bird feeders. Yeah, those blue jays taking over feeders. You just have to, you know, they're there. They'll eventually get away from the feeder, and the others will have their turn at it. Someone says, I found that attractive shrubs, beautyberry, flame bush provide good foraging. Yep, those fire bushes, flame bushes. I'm not sure what the flame bush is exactly, but yeah, it can attract a wide variety of species. Do I give a presentation on the Green Lib book? I do have that, and I've done presentations on that. It's a whole training that I do for developers. I've done that over the years. So yeah, I do have a presentation that goes through design, construction, and post-construction for developers and for planners. So yeah, happy to do that. Contact me and we could arrange a presentation for that. What about palms versus deciduous trees? You know, for bird habitat, I mean, the palm trees, they create quite a bit of fruit. And so a lot of the frugivorous birds like cedar waxwings, you can imagine all the different types of birds that eat the berries of the palms, but deciduous trees, you know, they provide a lot of insect habitat. And so it's really think about the diversity, not just having all palms, not just having all deciduous, but having a mixture to benefit a wide variety of species. Shelly put in that EDIS data information source. It's just edis.ifas.ufl.edu. Typical forest interior species. Well, there's quite a few of them, and some of them we're beginning to find out that they may not be. Like summer tanagers up in the Northeast are interior forest specialists. Even people say pileated woodpeckers are interior forest specialists. But if you lived in Florida, you've seen them in and out of residential areas. Those are like veeries are interior, another type of species is interior forest specialists. American redstart, those type of species are interior forest specialist birds. Someone asked about girdling trees. Yeah, I think snags are in short supply. So snags are dead or dying trees. Typically in urban areas, they're taken out. As long as they're not a danger to your home or to cars or to pedestrians, you could leave snags or you could cut them off so they're not a danger. And even that dead wood is, there's like over 26 species of birds that forage in and around snags or nest in these snags. Yeah, I answered about the palms versus deciduous. I said, yes, do a mixture. There's a question about mockingbirds and blue jay gang. Yeah, they tend to be very kind of exclusive if they find a food source. The only thing I can recommend is that there are some feeders out there that like goldfinch feeders that the bird has to hang upside down to feed. And so the blue jays and the mockingbirds can't do that. So you can design feeders or buy some feeders that are specific to the smaller species, like the goldfinch feeders that they have the hole to get to the feed is underneath the perch. And so only the goldfinch can do that. Well, Shelly, I think I'm at the bottom of those questions. Is that poll you just done a little bit different, or is that the same poll that everyone's been doing?
Yeah, I closed it. So I'll share the feedback with you.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's no more questions, thank you so much. That was very informative. I shared the link with everyone to the tool if they want to check that out. And it will be recorded. A couple people asked that, and I'll be posting it on the blog, which you should have the link to. It'll take me usually a few days or ideally really like a week before I have it up. But if you want to go back and review the presentation, it will be there for you to see. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Be safe out there. I'm enjoying the cooler weather if you're out in North Central Florida. But yeah, and contact me if you have any further questions. Someone said my email. This is my email here. Shelly, I'm not sure about the email versus blog. Maybe they want to link to your blog site.
Sure. I did post it up above here. Let's see.
Karen asked if there's any research projects we could volunteer with. Not research, but citizen science research. I mean, citizen science monitoring of birds. And what I would strongly suggest is going to iNaturalist. I'll put on here. It's a platform for people to record plants, animals, almost everything. And on there, there's a group called the Neighborhood Natural Area Network. I think that's a great way to get involved and to give input about the types of plants and animals in your neighborhood, in your yard. So if you just Google iNaturalist, it's a free app. It's a wonderful app. I'm gonna promote it here. It's that little green bird with the white, and it's a fantastic way to record all the species. I have like 1,300 observations, and it actually identifies, it can identify the plant or animal. If you get a good picture of the bird, it's hard to get a good picture of the bird with your the iNaturalist app. So I encourage anyone who's interested in promoting and encouraging what species are in their neighborhood to join iNaturalist and join the Neighborhood Natural Area Network. So yeah, fantastic question. I can't speak more highly about this app. It's I've had groups and citizens and Girl Scout troops from all over the state and other areas using the app, and you'll be amazed just taking pictures of plants in your own yard. You're like, what is that species? And there's a algorithm that can actually match all the identified species in the area to your picture and give you a suggestion what it is. So yes, do iNaturalist. I can't say more strongly that is a great way to get involved in the research that's going on in urban areas. That's I have one last question about Paraguay. Email me. I can give you a little my thoughts about it. It's a little more complicated, although I do think the results from North America apply to South America as well, particularly the migrants that are wintering there. So I can give you some research, a student that did from Colombia that did South America, and I can give you some information on that. So just email me. Here's my email.
All right, well, it's 4 o'clock. So again, thank you so much for presenting. And I'll share with you all the final numbers and the poll results. And
Yes.
thanks everyone else for joining, the few of you that are still here.
Thank you, everyone.